Okay, so we've learned quite a bit so far in terms of HTML and CSS, and you should be comfortable with at least going ahead and writing some very basic layouts and and then going ahead and looking up information. You should have a good grasp. However, what we're not doing is making sure our HTML and CSS is valid according to the W3C. Now, if I just open my browser, I have the W3C markup validation service and the W3 CSS validation service open. Now, what is the W3C or the W3 or W3.org? It's basically, if we head over to About W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium is an international community where member organizations, full-time staff, and the public work together to develop the web standards. So it's led by web inventor Tim Berners-Lee, and basically any specs that come out, so for example, say new CSS3 specs, new HTML5 specs, are all proposed and they go through a series on W3C. So this is a very a good place to come and validate your markup and CSS. Now there are CSS things called CSS linters, which we're going to be looking at at the end of the series in our web developer resource suggestions. However, here we're validating the markup that we've created so far. So let's actually copy this and let's just paste it straight into here. Now you can validate it by a URI, or you can upload a file, but most of the time you can just copy and paste it into direct input. So it now says this document was successfully checked as HTML5. Perfect. So we have no issue with the way that we initially marked up our document. We created our doc type and our meta, character encoding, stuff like that. The only two warnings are basically just to do with the potential issues with using the HTML5 conformance checker and also using the direct input mode. We're expecting a UTF or assuming a UTF-8 character encoding. So don't worry too much about these, but this is now a valid document. So what happens if we create some invalid markup? It could be absolutely anything. So for example, a cat element. So we'll say cat. So let's copy all of this and let's paste this in there. And let's go ahead and click revalidate. So now we've got an error. If we scroll down, we can actually see these errors. So here it says element cat not allowed as child of element body in this context. And that's because cat, unfortunately, is not a valid element. If this was anything else, for example, a div, and we went ahead and pasted this back in here and hit revalidate, you can see it's successfully checked as HTML5. So that it's the same thing as if you did, for example, an unordered list and within this did a div. This is not valid markup because the only thing that should really be within an unordered list is list items. Within the list items you could put anchors or whatever, but in this case this is invalid. It might work on the page sort of in some weird way, so if we were to just preview this in the browser, it works in an odd way, but it's not valid markup. So when we copy and paste this in, it should give us a good idea as to what the problem is. Sometimes it's a little bit generic in the way it gives warnings, but here element div not allowed as child of element unordered list in this context. So we get the same thing as a cat really. So both errors are the same, although there are completely different reasons why they're not allowed there. But generally, whenever you're building up a page, make sure you validate it with the W3C validator. That's really, really important. So the next thing really is to go on to CSS validation. So really in fact, I think another example for this would be to have maybe an anchor with an ID of, I don't know, test, and duplicate this down. What we should see here are a couple of errors. Just a couple of different errors just so we get a good thing. So we've got a duplicate ID. We've already spoken about duplicate IDs, that we can't have more than one ID on the page. And then it gives us the first occurrence of ID test was here. So it tells us where the first occurrence of it is, so we can eliminate any duplicate IDs. So there we go. The one thing that you want to do when you are building a site is make sure that if anyone else comes along and enters your website URL, you want it to at least validate as a valid site. So for example, we could, if we go back to the main page of this, validation by URI, we could type in wikipedia.com. Unfortunately, we get a couple of errors here while checking as HTML5, and you can see the BDI element is not supported by browsers yet, so we get a couple of errors here and quite a few warnings as well. So it's a good idea to really have a valid page. It also helps with things like search engine optimization. So when Google crawls your site, of course it's not a human looking at your website and saying, oh, that content's relevant. It's essentially going through your markup. So if the markup is invalid, so for example, if you've created a div element here, and within that you've created a div element, but you haven't ended that element, this is really confusing because for Google's crawlers, and I'm sure they're more intelligent than this, but to parse this is really confusing. So it just basically means that the whole layout, first of all, presentation-wise, will break, and second of all, it's going to make it really, really difficult for the W3C to actually, for Google to actually parse your content. So now let's look at CSS. This is a little bit different because what we will find is, for example, let's create an element in here with a class of box, and let's just say I am a box. So box is a valid class. We can say box, we can say background color slate gray, we can say height 100 pixels rather, width 100 pixels, and we can preview this in the browser. We know that it looks like that. We've looked at this example before, and we can validate our CSS, and it says here CSS level 3, e.g. CSS 3, and it's successfully validated. Now what happens if we do something like one box, for example, and we call this class one box? Okay, so first of all, it's broken on your site, and second of all, when we paste this into the validation, we should get a parse error, or here we go. In CSS1, a class name could start with a digit unless it was a dimension. In CSS2, such classes are parsed as unknown dimensions. So there we go. It really, you're just going to want to name your classes properly. So you want to say box. If you want to say box 1, you'd say box -1. We could change the markup here, and then on here, perfectly valid. So once you've written your markup, once you've written your styles, go ahead and make sure they're valid. That's really, really important. And later on, like I said at the end of the series, we'll look at linting, which is a slightly different approach to validating or checking your CSS, in which you'll get actual feedback based on potential issues, perhaps cross-browser or element or properties that aren't supported yet, things like that.